Cool.
Keely's saying maybe we should just
Hi, guys. Hey, what's going on, everybody? So welcome. We're going to give everybody just a few minutes to get into the room before we get started. We're waiting for one more co-host. She will be here momentarily. Do me a favor, if you can, there's a chat feature on the right side of your screen. So to all of the attendees, all you guys who are here for the webinar, do me a favor and just in the chat, let me know the name of your restaurant and where you guys are located. Just helps us give a little bit of context so we know sort of where everybody's based out of. It also makes for a much smaller world, and I think it's just better that way. Give me 2 minutes and we will get started. Like I said, we've got one more co-host who's going to be joining us. We will do all the introductions in a minute. And I just want to make sure, because we had, I don't know, a couple hundred people sign up for this thing. And I want to make sure that everybody who wants to be here has the opportunity to be here. Obviously, we're here to talk about tip pooling. So it's Tip Pooling 101. You can read it right on the slide. What every restaurant operator needs to know about building a fair, compliant, and scalable tip pool. You'll see in blue there, it says get access to Kickfin's free tip pooling templates. So Kickfin, they have these really great tip pooling templates that they give away for free. Stick around to the very end of the presentation. And I'm going to show you how to get them. Again, absolutely free. You're going to be able to text the number and they will be sent directly to you. So stick around all the way to the end. I will show you at that point. I'll tell you exactly how to do that. The other thing that I wanted to say really before we get started here is to, oh, great. Everybody's going into the text, into the chat feature, putting in where they are, your restaurants. I love it. Awesome. The other thing I wanted to say is as we go along in this presentation, we want to field your questions. We're just not going to answer the questions in real time. We're going to wait until the end. And actually, I already, people that I knew, listeners of my podcast had sent me questions and they said, hey, I know you're going to record this thing. I'm not going to be there, but if nobody else asks these questions, can you please make sure to cover these things? So log your questions in the chat as we go along. And we'll sort of keep track of them and scroll through at the very end. We'll leave time to do that. So in all, this is going to be about an hour long. We're going to aim for about 45 minutes so that we leave some time at the end for me to talk to you about the templates and so we can field any questions you got. Is that cool? Great. And again, if you're just joining us late, I ask that if you can, go into the chat feature and let me know the name of your restaurant and where you are located. It just helps give us a little bit of context, especially as we're sitting here staring into a webcam. It just helps us feel more hospitable and more connected. I'm moderating this conversation along with 3 other panelists. We're still waiting for the third panelist, but I am going to get started just a little bit because I know everybody's busy. Everybody's got crazy days. So I'll sort of go over the agenda. We'll do just a little bit of housekeeping before we do our introductions. So first things first, here's the agenda of what we're going to cover. We're going to deal with a little bit of housekeeping, right? So we talk about sort of what to expect over the course of this next 45 minutes to 50 minutes. We're going to meet each of us, all the panel, so you can understand why I think any of us are qualified to talk about the things that we're going to talk about. We're going to get into, we have to define this thing. What is tip pooling? And it's very close to tip sharing. And these are words that are used interchangeably. We've got people here who can really sort of navigate us through, talk about the differences. We're going to talk about the pros and cons of running a tip share, running a tip pool, pros and cons of running a certain kind of tip pool versus another kind. We're going to talk about some of the common tip distribution models. We're going to talk about alternatives that might be out there. We're going to be talking about compliance. It can be very difficult to navigate this, and it can be a little bit scary, especially if you feel like you're just doing this out on your own. Most importantly, what you guys really care about, we're going to go over 7 best practices. So you go through this, you'll learn a lot. You say, hey, I think this is great. This could be for me. Where do I go next? This webinar wouldn't be half as valuable if we didn't give you some action items for where to go next. Beth is here. She is just signing on. So we've got all of our co-hosts, which is great. You're just in time. We're going to do a little bit of housekeeping, and then we're going to let everybody introduce themselves. This is really important Here's our housekeeping, a little bit of a disclaimer. You see here, content of this webinar is not intended to be professional guidance. You have to, right? So please consult an attorney for questions specific to your company, specific to your state and your municipality. Any advice we give is not going to apply for every single state and every single municipality. It's really important that we're going to give you guidance, but you have to go seek professional guidance in your town, in your state. Undoubtedly, they're going to be the best ones to do this. So this is not legal advice. This is just a little bit of guidance to get you in the right direction and to sort of dust some of the cobwebs, take some of the fog out of the way. Is this being recorded? Yes, it's absolutely being recorded. The recording will be distributed later this week. So if you've signed up, meaning if you are here, you will get it sent to you. For those of you who are not here, who are watching later, obviously you have gotten access to that. I said at the very beginning, at the top, we've got these really great tip pooling templates that Kickfin, they give out for free. They are phenomenal. Stick around to the very, very end. I'm going to tell you how to get them. You're going to text a number and they're going to be sent directly to you. They're absolutely free. And if you feel like it's the right thing for you, I think you're going to find that those are really going to help you. And then again, questions, put them in the chat as we go along. We will cover them. We will cover them at the very, very end. So rest assured. The last thing I wanted to say here is some of these slides are very wordy. We did that so that you can take notes, so that you can be as thorough as possible. But please do pay attention to what the co-hosts are saying. I'm moderating this discussion. These guys are really the experts on it, and they've got a lot of stuff that wouldn't fit on the slides. And if you just got your head buried, you're gonna miss all of that. So please, please, please make sure to tune in and listen in. That's my housekeeping notes. Let's meet the panel. I will kick things off. I will introduce myself. Anybody that doesn't know me, my name is Chip Klose. I live here in New York City. I actually live just outside of New York City, so it's a bit of a lie. After 20 years in the city, I moved my family out to the suburbs. I'm a restaurant coach, so I work with owners and operators all over the world through my group coaching program. I'm also the host of the Restaurant Strategy podcast. We just celebrated our 4th birthday at the beginning of April. So again, it's a show that if you don't know it, I would urge you to check it out. It's an incredible community. We have really great conversations. New episodes come out every Monday and Thursday. Really great community that we've built there on the Restaurant Strategy podcast. That's me. I matter much less than the rest of the panelists up here. Justin, introduce yourself, introduce Kickfin, and get this thing going.
Chip, thanks for hosting us today. We feel lucky to be here with you and the audience. My name is Justin Roberts. I'm one of the co-founders of Kickfin. For those that you that may be new to Kickfin, we are the largest digital tipping platform in the market today. It's surprising that 90% of hospitality venues are still tipping in physical currency today. So there's really 2 ways in which people use our product. One, for those that are tipping in cash, we make it really easy for operators to stand up a fully digital and compliant tipping platform to process tips directly to the employee's bank of choice. And the second being, for those that are in a non-point of sale environment that are looking to turn on tipping to increase employees' earnings via tips, we also have an acceptance product that it's been really exciting to see as far as other verticals adopting. So we feel lucky to be here to be a resource to the community, and I will have the good fortune of passing this to my colleague Larisa to make a quick introduction.
I'm Larisa Thomas. I'm the VP of Operations here at Kickfin. Basically, once a customer signs up with us, me and my team, we take care of them from walking them through the implementation and getting them started on the app to addressing any possible support issues that may come up along the way. And so, Beth?
Yeah. Hi, my name is Beth Schroeder. I'm a partner with the law firm of Raines Feldman in Los Angeles. We also have offices in New York and Chicago. I do employment law. I've done employment law for 38 years, and probably 75, 80% of my practice is hospitality, and quite a bit of it has been in the area of the ever-changing regulations on tip pool and tip sharing.
Yeah, excellent. The best part about pulling together a panel like this, and I'm guessing that a lot of the attendees here who are sitting here watching this, or even if you're watching this after the fact, is that oftentimes as independent operators, we can feel really siloed. We can feel really alone. The best part about Justin, Larisa, Beth, is that they all get to peek behind the curtains of a lot of different businesses. I get to peek behind the curtain of a lot of different businesses. I currently coach with over 50 different owners and operators from all over the world. And so we get perspective, and we get to share that with all of you guys. That's really something that comes out in these things. So it's one of the best parts. To think of this as a form of networking. You get to see behind the curtain at a lot of different businesses through by virtue of this presentation. That's who we are. Let's get into the meat of this. We got to start by defining this, right? What exactly is tip pooling? As you see here, tip pooling, yes, is legal. It's a legal practice in the service industry where tipped employees contribute some or all of their tips that they've earned into a pool at the end of the shift. Right? Tip pooling, tip sharing are used interchangeably, but technically they are not the same. We're going to get into that. We're going to cover that. The majority of restaurants out there operate some type of tip pool or tip sharing. Larisa, you get to work with this a lot. I mean, it says here 88%. I mean, is it really that big, right?
Yeah, in some form or another, the vast majority of our customers have some kind of process for sharing tips amongst their employees.
Yeah, I think so. When we're talking about it, we're talking about how do we collect the tips and how do we distribute the tips, right? There are two pieces to that. And again, there's tip pooling and tip sharing. There's anything that I have a passion for. It's taking really complicated, scary things like this. We're talking about compliance and legal issues, and we're going to try and simplify it. So that's a common thread you're going to see over the next little while. So know that the whole point of this, again, knock off the cobwebs, get rid of some of the fog that you might have. A lot of people have some version of this. Undoubtedly, most of the people tuning in would probably agree. I'm guessing 88% of you have this as well. So, to pool or not to pool, right? We just heard vast majority have some version of tip pool, but it's not right for every restaurant. Justin, walk us through some of the benefits of the tip pool.
Well, that is the question, my friend. I would say when you think about tip pooling, there's no denying the fact that gratuities are a critical part of an employee's work engagement at any restaurant operation. It makes up, 50, 60% of their overall wages. And so how it's handled is very, very important to employees. And we know that there's pros and cons to both. Obviously, what we're finding with our operators is that when they extend the pool to address people that are in back of house, it really fosters a very much team environment. We are going to get this done together. We care what dishes go out, not just in the direct facing to the customer, but it really aligns everybody around performance. And what we find the best operators do is they don't just extend a tipping pool policy and sit on it. They very much incorporate that into their weekly stand-up meetings, performance reviews, and they really look at the policy as a way to make sure that it's equitable, that people feel like they have visibility. And so when I think of the benefits, those are kind of the key topics of transparency, visibility, constant communication about what is being pooled and where it's going to ensure that the overall performance of the team is at an ultimate peak. Larisa, do you want to touch a little bit on the considerations, though?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest considerations when crafting your tip pool policy is how you're going to roll it out to your staff and how they're going to receive it. Tip pooling, tip sharing, it's one of those employees either love it or they hate it. There's not a lot in between. And when you look at the reasons why employees don't like a tip pool or a tip share scenario, it is almost always boiling down to the fact that they don't have visibility to how the tips are calculated. They don't have visibility to who all is being included. Managers may or may not being included in the tip pool in a way that is legal or illegal. There's a lot of cloudiness around the policy. They can't see that they're being treated fairly. They can't see that they're receiving all the wages that are due to them. And so the number one thing that you need to consider when you're rolling out or revamping a tip pool or tip share policy is how are you going to explain it to your staff and how are you going to hold yourself accountable to them that you are paying them what they are due?
So in a lot of this, I got to kick it to our resident attorney here. So part of this has to do with regulations, and I think part of the confusion here Beth, talk to us about why are the regulations confusing, or why can they be confusing?
Well, first of all, they've changed over the years. We didn't get clarification until 2018 about whether the back of the house could be included in a tip pool or tip share at the federal level. And so a lot of employees still don't think it's legal, and you get pushback. And so in many cases, when we have employers rolling out tip pool, tip share plans, the employees come running forward saying, you can't do this, it's illegal. And, you know, even when the tip pool or tip plan is completely legal. So we usually go in armed with a lot of information, a lot of transparency, as both Justin and Larisa have said. And I think that's first and foremost, you know, the importance of it is absolute transparency, but then also information about what the law says, how it's been changed, and information to the employees about what the current law has said. And because employees think something is illegal, and we want them to have information about what the law currently said, it has gone back and forth. And so it's not surprising that it's confusing. Lawyers are confused about it.
Yeah.
It's also changed from state to state, by the way, because depending on whether you have to get tip credits or don't have tip credits depends on whether you can include back of the house or not. So it's complicated, and that's why, you know, it's doesn't surprise me that a lot of people are confused, and then a lot of employers don't do it right. So you have all of those layers on it, which make it complicated.
Yeah, and I will say here that it's worth putting in here. I said a few minutes ago that oftentimes as independent operators, which I'm guessing as I'm looking here, people logging in the chat, you know, where they are, what the name of their places are. I'm guessing that the majority of the people in attendance here are independent operators. And again, we almost always feel siloed. It's easy to feel like you're separate, like your problems are unique and your own. And I think what you find is that the more you talk to people, the more you'll find you're dealing with the same thing. If there's any bit of advice I can give here at this point, is that start building on your network in your town, in your community, and start asking questions. Just get to know the other restaurant owners and say, hey, what do you do? What do you do? How do you do it? What do you do it? Not that you're going to do exactly what they do, but you just get a sense of sort of what is possible out there. And I think ultimately that ends up being something that's going to reap, you know, all kinds of dividends down the line, not just for this, but this especially. I want to move over into this where we talk about tip distribution methods, right? So we talk about how those tips are combined, how those tips are then divvied up. Justin, again, like I said at the beginning, you get to peek behind a lot of different curtains. Talk us through this just a little bit here.
Yeah, so as we see tip sheets and tip policies, you know, come across our desk, both on the sales and operations side, I can confidently say we've never seen one that's the exact same. Everybody has a very nuanced, unique way of trying to kind of structure their tip policies, and it's quite surprising. I mean, even by brand, each store has their different policies that are in place. I would say the common themes that we're seeing are like percentage of total sales, food and beverage, bar, and how they're basically consuming the data from point of sale and dividing it up based off of those two parameters. The others is just kind of weighting it. So, you know, and I'm making this up just for the conversation purposes, but bartenders 3%, bussers, you know, 2%, hostess 1%. But I'd like to share a quick best practice in the way in which some of the best operators are leaning into the overall communication transparency. And I'm going to focus on the percentage of a sale. So we love the data. We love to see where certain restaurants tipping volume is peaking. And so we pulled one client over and we said, listen, obviously this store is far out exceeding overall sales compared to the other one. What's the why behind that? And it was interesting. They highlighted the dessert menu. And they said, instead of going over and plopping down the menu to say, are you guys interested in dessert? They retrained their service staff to kind of take a poll. Who at the table likes chocolate cake and who at the table likes ice cream? And the hands would go up on either scenario. And what they found is when the waitress or waiter was able to ask or kind of nudge them to say, hey, you love chocolate cake, let's get that over to you. by simply kind of allowing that server to engage in a way to make it easy for the guest to say, yes, I want to try that. It increased sales, which increased overall tip volume quite significantly. And so I would say, again, I go back to this. It's one thing to just put forward a tipping policy, but in this instant with the client that we had, when they retrained to know that the impact of what that server is talking about and the additional menu options that they can upsell, it dramatically increases the tip pool, the percentage of overall sales, which is, again, a fantastic recruiting and retention tool when you can pull that information out and share it with the team as a whole. Larisa, I know there's a lot of things on your side of it as well, because we often joke about the complexities of these tech documents, but I'd love just to kind of get your thoughts on the points-based and hours worked element to it.
Yeah, once you've figured out how you're going to put money into the pool, whether you're pulling everything or whether you're pulling a percent, based on sales, or pulling a percent of the tips received, how you share it becomes a really interesting math problem for yourselves. So the simplest way to share it is based on the hours worked. So you look at the shift, you take the total number of hours worked by all employees, and you divide up their share of tips by their share of the hours that were worked. Really straightforward mathematics, right? 4 hours out of the 16 goes to one person, 4 hours out of 16 goes to another person, 8 hours out of the 16 goes to the third person, and that's the percentage they get of the tips, just for simple math. The points-based system adds a layer of nuance where you have a situation where you maybe have a bunch of different types of roles, several of which that are customer facing in various degrees of responsibility and or authority. And you want to be able to weight those hours based on that level of interaction with the customer. So the more customer facing they are, the heavier weight they get towards the tip pool. So the more points they have assigned to their job position. And then you look at that number of points per hour worked, and then you calculate your percentage of tips off of the total number of points earned by each person for each shift. Usually we're seeing that points-based system in the more fine dining and larger restaurants where they have several layers, where there's runners and food assistants and bussers and various levels of customer facing roles. One of the other things that has actually become more complicated with the pandemic is the increased prevalence of tipping on to-go and delivery orders as well. And so we've seen another number of customers having to incorporate those tips into their tip pool or tip share calculation. And it depends on who's touching those to-go orders. Is it your host that is packaging up so those tips go to them? Is it your kitchen that's packaging the to-go orders? Do you have an expo who's doing it? Is everybody pitching in? So does it just need to go into the general tip pool? You guys need to decide what rules are going to govern those types of transactions and the tips that result from them, so that everybody knows what they're earning when they're working on those to-go orders. So that's been one of the levels of complication that have come in the recent years. Each restaurant's going to have something like that. Each market may have something like that where it's unique to your local area that you have to account for when you're developing a policy to see what's going to be able to be competitive with the other restaurants in the area in terms of retaining your employees and providing them with a wage that they feel happy about receiving.
So I want to pause right here because this is, I think, all really good, but we have to get into this conversation of tip share versus tip pool.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know who wants to, Larisa, if you want to kick us off, because they're used interchangeably, but they are not the same. Give us a really clear, clean definition. What's tip sharing and what's tip pooling?
Tip pooling is when all of the tips received are pooled together and distributed to the employees who are eligible for that pool. So regardless of what the table may have left you as an individual for a tip, you're going to get your share of that based on your hours worked, for example.
Yep.
So you're not keeping any of your personal tips. It all goes
Okay.
into a collective.
Great.
Tip sharing is where a server may receive tips at the table, and then they can elect to share a certain percentage of their tips with their support staff that goes into a pool for that support staff to share based on, say, their hours worked. So it's kind of a hybrid system where the server is only sharing a portion. Now, some jurisdictions, you're able to tell your server what their percentage is that's going to be shared with their staff. Other jurisdictions, you have to maybe only provide a recommendation, but it's going to be left up to the discretion of the server to determine how much they're going to tip out their support staff that night, depending on how the night went.
Great. So it's really clear because, and we use these interchangeably, but many restaurants have used a tip share for years. And a tip pool is something we're hearing more and more about. And anybody who knows the podcast knows that I say this all the time. I really was raised in this industry through fine dining. I've spent the last 20 years working in fine dining where tip pools are very prevalent. I've worked in tip share restaurants, but I've done a lot of tip pools. And what we're seeing now is that the tip pool is sort of trickling down, making their way into all kinds of other different kinds of concepts, which is why we're having this conversation. So I just want to make sure that's really clear. Again, I want to put out there, if anybody has any questions about this, about anything we're saying, if I'm not articulating it right, please put them in the chat. I'm collecting all of these. I'm keeping really diligent notes on all of them, and we'll get to them at the very end. So how they're combined, how they're divvied up, that's really getting into the nuts and bolts of a tip share versus a tip pool. So there are a couple other words that, as we were all prepping for this, so for the attendees, as the co-hosts were all prepping for this, we just thought we have to talk about this. And Beth was really clear about this. She's like, we have to spend just a second on this. So service charges, surcharges, what are they? What's the difference? Beth, walk us through this.
Yeah. So this became very popular. It started to become very popular in the alternative compensation models prior to COVID, especially out here in lovely California, where minimum wages have been going up and up and up and continue to go up every year. I think July 1st, West Hollywood will have the highest minimum wage in the country. But a lot of municipalities, a lot of employers have been using service charges and surcharges as somewhat creative methods to bring in income to compensate against and somewhat, take into account for these ever increasing minimum wages. So service charges and surcharges are methods which the employer or the house brings in income directly from customers. That's actually assessing income. So you put a charge on the menu and it's income to the restaurant. That is not, and that is something that is different from a gratuity. Employers over the years have used this term autograt, which I want people to, I didn't even want to put it on the slide. I want people to ban it from their mouths because autograt is not a legal term and people confuse it. And the problem with it is that it starts to cross lines. There is no such thing as an autograt. A gratuity is a gratuity. It's a tip. And a service charge or a surcharge should be income to employers. And it's income to employers. You take sales tax on it. And if you pay it out to employees, it is then wages, compensation to the employees. It has to go on their W-2 and everything else. It increases the regular rate. It affects their overtime rate, and it's very complicated. So we wanted to talk about it here because we're going to contrast service charges and surcharges from what we are talking about, which is tips, tip sharing, and tip pools. It's really a very different conversation, and it's a much larger conversation and not what we're going into today. There are also certain jurisdictions, such as Santa Monica, West Hollywood, and I think the airport zone in Los Angeles and other jurisdictions across the country that mandate what you do with surcharges and service charges, for example, that make you pay all of it to the employees and not retain any of it by the employer. So you have to know where you are. Also, the city attorneys and district attorneys are getting involved in this. If you put down and describe your surcharge, for example, say you're having a benefit surcharge or a pandemic surcharge, and not using that surcharge in the method in which you say you are, they're getting involved in saying that there are violations of customer fraud and things like that. So all of this is extremely complicated. And we just want to tell people that when you are deciding how to market your alternative compensation plans, if you're going to consider something like a service charge or a surcharge, think very carefully, talk to attorneys. It's very complicated about how you put it on your menus and how you put it on your guest checks. So as we say, don't do this alone at home. As Chip is saying, this is not really the conversation for today, but we wanted to spend just a little bit of time here to distinguish the conversation from service and surcharge from tips and tipping, which is a very, very different issue.
Yeah, and I know a lot of people have sort of gotten dinged by this. Like you said, service charges and surcharges accrue sales tax in many states, and I know a lot of people were sort of surprised by this when their accountants told them that. So we are not talking about this when we're talking about tip sharing, tip pooling. We are talking about gratuities.
Correct.
Correct. We mentioned autograt once. Now I've mentioned a second time. It's the last time we're going to mention it because it's not a thing, as Beth said.
It's not a thing, and please don't use it. It's gotten more restaurants in trouble than not. And if people have questions about service charges and surcharges, they can feel free to. Someone already mentioned it here in the chat. It is very big in areas of California. We understand why. If you have questions about it, feel free to contact me, but it is not really the conversation we're talking about today.
Perfect. All right. So now we get into compliance, right? So we talked a little bit about this. Beth, I'm going to bounce back to you in just a second because, again, you are a resident legal Sherpa here as we talk about this. First things first, can tip pools be mandatory?
Tip pools can be mandatory as long as they're done properly, which is a big if. I'm going to just start again in California because, again, the rules are very different in different states. And that's when we start talking about this amongst our group. You can mandate a tip pool under federal and state law. And again, funny enough, all 50 states are in the United States. So you have to make sure, first of all, you're complying with federal law. And then you have to look to your own state to see if you're complying with your particular state's law. So, for example, California said you could include the kitchen employees before federal law did. So it's like, whoa, that's wonderful. Thanks, California. But it didn't do us any good until federal law was straightened out. So California said you could do it in 2008. Federal law wasn't clear on it until 2018. So now you can do it in both places. But one thing that is pretty clear in most states, you cannot include managers. So anybody who has managerial duties at any time during their employment, for example, I see somebody's already asked a question. Well, I've got a bar manager, can he be included in the shifts where he's not a bar manager? If you have somebody who has managerial duties anytime they're working for you, that person's going to be considered an agent of the employer. And if they're an agent of the employer for 5 minutes during your employment, at any time they work for you, they're an agent of your employment, period. They can't receive a tip share. They might be able to receive a direct tip, but not a tip share or tip out. They can't be in your tip pool or tip share because they're receiving a part of a tip pool or tip share as an agent of the employer, and that's going to disqualify your tip pool. So these are just some of the things that when we say, can tip pools be mandatory, if they're done properly, and that's a big if.
Great. So I'll use this as an opportunity to, again, do this little legal disclaimer, right? We're giving you guidance. We're sort of opening the door, trying to shed some light on this subject. But at the end of the day, you have to consult an attorney in your state, in your locality, because city, township, state laws are all different. And where Beth works here, she does a lot of work in California. Her firm is sort of in many different states, but she does a lot of work in California, which is its own sort of kettle of fish, as the saying goes. So are they mandatory, or can they be mandatory? Yes, assuming you roll it out right. Who can participate in a tip pool? Not managers. It says here, right? So what if tip managers are performing duties of a tipped employee, as long as they're, and I just want to make sure I understand Beth right, as long as they're an agent of the company doing something, anything for the company, that sort of disqualifies them. Am I understanding it right?
And we've had tip shares or tip pools disqualified. Even we have, for example, maitre d's, and this happens in fine dining a lot. Maitre d's in many cases have the ability, especially when no official manager is there, to cut employees or change schedules or do things that managers in many cases at restaurants have done. And we get lawsuits questioning the tip pools or tip shares because these sometimes very highly tipped maitre d's, when we look at policies or look at something else, the maitre d's are the ones left in charge. So it's not just their managerial titles, it's what they have responsibility to do. So we have to be very, very careful of who's included and what those people have responsibility for. In fine dining, maitre d's sometimes have those responsibilities that an assistant manager would have.
So Beth, I just want to highlight this real quick because we got a couple of quick questions from both Randy and Alicia in here, and they just said, please clarify. So managers, define direct tip allowed to a manager, and then Alicia asked, management can receive direct tips, but not in a tip pool tip share. Can you clarify that?
I'll give you examples, and we usually see these and I'll give you the example that was held in a California case. There was a case called Chow versus Starbucks, and it's we see these in fast casual more than we see them in anything else. But sometimes, for example, and I'll give you the fine dining example, let's say that somebody directly tips that maitre d' and says, thank you for my table, and literally puts a $20 tip in that maitre d's hand. Doesn't get shared with anybody else, maybe that should have been, but somebody puts a direct tip in the hand of that maitre d'. And the maitre d' keeps it. That's a direct tip. But the Chow case is a tip jar. And the tip jar got shared amongst everybody at the front of the counter. And this involved a shift lead at Starbucks. Starbucks has a lot of reported cases, by the way, because they're a big employer. And the shift jar was shared amongst all the people at the front. The shift lead, who had some managerial duties as a lead, shared the tips with everybody else in the jar. And they basically said, well, the lead was sharing them with everybody else, but that jar was left directly with all the people at the counter. And therefore, it wasn't a tip out situation. It wasn't a share situation. It wasn't that the lead was being tipped by somebody else. They were actually being tipped by all the guests, and that jar was being shared by everybody. So it was as if they were being directly tipped. So that's what it is. Or if you had a manager who was occasionally taking tables and was getting their own tips and then tipped out to other employees as a tip share, that would probably be allowed. But if you had a bartender manager who was being tipped out by a server, and that bar manager was getting a tip share, that would be a problem.
Yeah. Okay, great. Perfect. I want to bounce this to Larisa and talk about these processing fees. Can I deduct credit card processing fees from tips or tip pools?
At a federal level, the simple answer is yes. But increasingly, individual jurisdictions are prohibiting this. We just had 2 more states add themselves to the list in the last 6 months to 12 months of specifically prohibiting credit card processing. So you really need to know your local state law regarding this. Generally speaking, it tends to be an East Coast, West Coast kind of thing, where most of the states that are prohibiting these fees from being deducted from the wages tend to be on the 2 coasts, with the middle of the state typically not commenting on whether or not it is allowed or not. There's no law specifically prohibiting it or specifically allowing it either. So you really need to understand locally what's allowed for you in terms of this. And then one of the other things we see come up a lot is, if you elect to put the tips onto payroll, are you suddenly causing a wage violation because you're withholding their wages? It's something we see a lot on employee forums and other things like that, where they're upset because they suddenly feel like their wages are being withheld unfairly to them. The bottom line is, as long as you are paying your employees all of their wages on their next available paycheck, you're going to be generally okay. That is considered an acceptable form of payment to them. There are no state rules or regulations saying that you have to pay out tips on the day that they are earned. restaurants would be getting in trouble all over the country, mostly because you have envelopes that you're holding because the servers will leave before the day is done and they have to come back another day to pick up their tips. That alone, should tell you that you don't have to pay out on the day that the tips are earned themselves. That is very much a cultural thing within the restaurant industry, not a legal issue.
Great. We are just scratching the surface on compliance issues, and we have a bunch to get to. Like I said, the best practices, which is the actionable portion of this, we're going to scroll through really quickly. Not because they don't deserve time, but because we did get a bunch of questions, and I want to make sure we loop back around to some of these questions that we received. So, Justin, kick us off. 7 tip pooling best practices. Number 1, determine the right tip pool structure for your restaurant. Walk us through this.
Absolutely. Obviously, by segment, right? So you're going to have quick service doing it very different from how the pool is set up compared to a full service. I would say the common theme that we're seeing across is just simplify. Simplify in a way that both the operator can understand and the employee can also just metabolize really quickly and easily. The point that I want to make is that as a service to the industry, we put a ton of content out there. So on our website, you're going to see templates, you're going to see best practices and case studies. We will continue to push this out so that depending on the market segment in which you operate in, you can clearly define what potential tipping structure, what policy would be best suited for the operator. So all of that content would be on our website at kickfin.com.
Great. Beth, I'm going to kick this to you. It says here, create a written policy and get legal approval. How do we start?
Well, like Justin said, everybody's policy is slightly different, but I'm a fan of putting these policies in writing. I don't think they need to be in your handbook, but they should definitely be in writing for all the reasons that we've already talked about today. Transparency. I think we actually get to it on some of the lower numbers here, but distribute it, managers first get acceptance and then to your employees get questions, but make sure that everybody knows what it is. I have a lot of clients who say, well, we have a policy, but we really don't want to have it in writing. It just creates questions. You
got to have it written down.
Have it written down and then make sure that people understand it, so that everyone understands what what they're playing with. It eliminates all these issues that people are saying.
Perfect. All right, Beth, you brought this to me. This is listen. I learned something as I was prepping for this. You said the other day, it's a backstop your policy. What do you mean by that?
Okay, so again, this is somewhat jurisdictional, but I'll use California as the example. So the cases in California that measure reasonableness, when you're talking about tip shares, measure it against the percentages that the servers are tipping out to other employees and the percentages of which they're tipping out their tips. So we've been talking today a lot about percentages of sales, and that's precisely because most employers, if they're mandating policy, the only way they can measure it is looking at sales. But that's not how the cases measure it. The cases measure it as a percentage of tips. For example, is the server tipping out X percentage of their own tips? So the reasonableness standard, you're looking at sales, the cases are looking at tips, and they're not necessarily the same. What if a server has a bad night, if they have a lot of walkouts? So I like to backstop it or put a safe harbor in the policy by saying at no point would a server be required to tip out more than X percentage of their own tips. And that way, because they know what their tips are, you may not. So if you're requiring someone to tip out X percentage of food sales or bar sales or something like that, you can always have that policy put in there just as a legal backstop. Most likely that's never going to happen, but at least legally you can say, well, we would never have required you to tip out more than X percentage of. And then your policy has that legal backstop in it.
Yeah, great. Larisa, walk us through this one. Solicit employee input in a structured way. What's the best way to structure this?
Again, this all goes towards transparency, right? Making the process transparent to your staff. Start by soliciting their input before you even begin to write a policy. What have they experienced at other employers that they liked? What have they experienced at other employers that they didn't like? What have they seen worked, in their experience, and what things would they be willing to, be excited about participating in. You can do that through a survey. You can do that through team meetings. It really depends on kind of your group, how close knit you are, how small, how large, how many different roles you have that you want to get information from. Once you've gathered that information, start to write your policy, get an initial draft run by legal, and then run the policy by your staff before you implement it, before it's finalized. Tell them it's a draft, tell them this is what you're thinking, solicit their feedback again. And then once you finalize the policy and you get it blessed by your legal advisors, then you roll out the policy, start a clear start date, make sure that the calculator is well understood, available so that they can see how actual examples in the real world are getting calculated each night. And make sure that, if anybody has questions, you answer them. Not having it written down isn't going to stop questions from happening.
Yeah.
Having it written down stops
Yeah.
questions from happening, because then they can answer them for themselves. They understand it, they feel good about it, and they feel like they're supported by their management team.
Yeah, for sure. Justin, take us through this one. Leverage technology for efficiency, accuracy, and compliance. This is sort of right up your wheelhouse.
It is. And restaurant operators are also amazing at managing a tech stack, from point of sale, online ordering, scheduling, you name it. Yet the most analog piece that exists is the way that gratuities are paid for. And so it's not an if, but more of a when. We're seeing operators look at this and saying, this is the most outdated way in which we're managing our business, doing bank runs, bank teller work, reconciliation, skimming and theft, the list goes on. What the best operators are doing today is they're leveraging a platform like Kickfin that can take the compliance, complexity, and overall burden of managing gratuities, processing the tips directly to the employee's bank of choice the second their shift is done, and then closing the loop by making sure that the reporting is a click of a button for them to capture the overall earnings for that day. So technology, technology, technology.
Love it. Number 6, Larisa, don't overcomplicate. We've gone through this whole thing and it sounds very complex. And it seems like it's something that's very easy to complicate. How do we streamline it and simplify it?
Keep it very simple for yourself and for your restaurant. Figure out what's going to fit for you. If you have a bartender team, a server team, and maybe a busser team, you don't need to do a points-based system. You can do a basic hour point system. Your bartenders might get a portion of the share from table service. Your bussers will get a portion of the share from the table service, and you distribute that simply according to them based on their hours. Only get more complicated as you need to. If your restaurant's complicated with the more positions you have, you may need to layer in some order of complexity, but start super simple, start super small, keep it really straightforward for your team, and don't make it any more complicated than you need to.
Yep, I love it. And this, listen, I'm gonna field this one, but I mean, over communicate everything. I think every one of the panelists at one time or another have said transparency, transparency, over communication. Write it down, answer the questions, do it in a structured way. I mean, Justin, have you seen what ways to do this? Have you seen this really successful?
Well, listen, every operator develops great cultures, right? It's why they stick around and why employees love this industry. The best operators use the way in which performance is done for the output of gratuities. They make it front and center, they make it transparent, and they really tie in, their ability to use the tip wage to increase the lives and earnings of the employees. So again, the best operators keep it simple, over communicate, and then also just very much aligned to reminding that performance provides the ability for them to earn more. And that's what helps for retention.
Yeah, I love it. Listen, as we were putting this webinar together, there were sort of 3 things that were outside of, like, we couldn't figure out where to put them, and yet we all agreed we got to talk about these things. So 3 additional considerations. Larisa, walk us through, because you handled this so eloquently the other day, and I was just learning from you and taking notes. So walk us through these 3.
Your tip pool, consider your team size. Does a tip share make more sense? Does a tip pool make more sense? How many people are on shift at any given time? That's going to determine how complicated your calculator needs to be in terms of how you figure it out. Do you have technology that's going to help you? Does your POS aid you in figuring out how tips should be distributed? Do you have the ability to enter in declared tips? Do your servers have the ability to enter in what they're sharing with their support staff as part of the POS? Is there a way that you can systematize the collection of your tip share or tip pool data so that you can just pull a report from your POS or other technology that will allow you to distribute the tips in a way that's simpler for your management team to do. So they're not spending hours trying to create an Excel spreadsheet at the end of the night just to figure out how much to pay everybody.
Right.
The most interesting one, I think, is your local employment market. Every jurisdiction is different. Beth has told us a little bit about the uniqueness of California and particularly the LA area. Culturally, does your tip pool fit in? Are you going to be able to attract employees, and are you going to be able to retain employees? Or are you creating a tip pool that's going to put you at a competitive disadvantage against the other restaurants in your local area? Understand where you fit in your local ecosystem.
Yeah, I think when we got to these three the other day, it was like understanding those three is super key. They're real big considerations. Seems weird to save them for last, but thought of another way. These things have the last word here. We have made it all the way to the end and save time for questions. I want to remind you, I told you at the very beginning that Kickfin has these awesome tip pooling, like calculators, spreadsheets, all of that. If you want the templates, this is all you have to do. You text pool, POOL, to that number, 33777, and you will get these things absolutely for free. They've sort of given them away before, and I think we all thought it was a great idea to give them away here. So again, text pool to the number 33777. Q&A, I've been writing them down and copying and pasting and getting them ready. So in no particular order, or these are a little bit in order from the way they came in, but not entirely, because I tried to reorder them in a way that made sense, and I might have made it more complicated. Sorry in advance. But we got about, I don't know, 6 or 7 minutes left to cover these. Randy asked, actually, Randy asked a couple of questions, so I'll sort of bunch them together. Randy asks, can an individual who is involved in the service that generates tipping be a dual role employee and still be allowed to participate in the split, or is a manager that also bartends on the same shifts as other bartenders not allowed to participate? We'll field that one first. I don't know, Larisa, Beth, Justin, who wants to jump on that?
I think we sort of addressed that if somebody is a manager at any time, they can't receive a tip share. They might be able to, although I think maybe somebody asked later, if it's a bar manager, can they directly receive tips from a bar patron? And the answer to that would be yes. So again, they could directly receive tips from a bar patron. They couldn't receive a tip share, a tip out from a server. I think that would be the differentiation. That would explain the difference between a direct tip and an indirect tip.
Great. Randy's other question, and I think we covered this. I just want to be clear. Can a manager take a direct tip from a staff member who desires to give the manager a tip, or must that manager decline?
I never believe that anything an employee does that is on the line legally is being done voluntarily. It's like, oh, what if they volunteer to work overtime and don't get paid for it? They're going to come back later and say it was never voluntary. So just don't have them do it. Don't have anybody voluntarily give management any money. It's like, well, I would have voluntarily given an employee, a loan out of my pocket, or I'll voluntarily pay for this broken, dish. No, just don't have them do it.
Yeah, great. Okay. Jack asked, I think I know the answer to this, but I'm going to let the pros handle it. Jack asked, do cash tips need to be included in the tip pool or tip share?
Well, I'll go ahead, Larisa.
No, go for it, Justin.
I mean, here's the thing. We know that 97, 98% of transactions are all done via credit card. There is few and far between in most full service establishments where people are carrying cash. In the event, and this is kind of employer by employer, cash is left on the table, they'll pretty much pocket that. We suggest report it, but again, 9 times out of 10, the vast majority of credit card bills will go in, they'll get sliced and diced, digitally paid out. For the little amounts here or there, again, it's employer preference, say report it, but most just put in the pocket and move on.
Here's my 2 cents, and I'm sure I know what Beth is going to say, but even if the tip pool, right, there's some gray area, the IRS is all black or white. And if you're not declaring that, the IRS is going to want their piece of it. And so for that respect, this is how I've run my tip pools for a while, back when I was managing and all that. It's just like everything goes in because there are multiple government agencies that will have a vested interest in figuring out what's declared and what's not declared. That's the thing that we didn't really talk about, sort of compliance with IRS and taxation and all of that. But that sort of strikes me as we hear the question.
Obviously, the rule is you're supposed to put everything in.
Yeah, great. And other people are sort of weighing in the chat saying our tip policy states that all tips cash are included. It's one for all for one. All of that.
I actually had one client who fired somebody over literally taking a few cents. So, I mean, that's kind of how strict my clients are about it.
Yeah. So Mike asked the question. I want to make sure, Mike, that I read your question. I talked about the managers being on site, participating in the tip pool, but there's a general manager who's off site. I think we covered that. If they have management duties, if they are agents of the organization at the company, they can't participate in the tip pool or tip share. You're just going to open yourselves up to all kinds of litigation that I would recommend not doing. So he was asking a very specific instance, but I think it still falls under sort of the guidance that other people have been giving here.
And Chip, there's one additional question here from Anthony. It's kind of the flip side of that, of a manager being able to tip out their staff. I would think of it as you can tip down, but you shouldn't tip up. So a manager who receives a direct tip.
You can receive a tip from a patron and tip out. Yes. You cannot receive from an employee.
Yep.
Ever.
Great. Perfect. I think that's a really good, and thank you for catching that, Larisa. I appreciate that. Larisa, this is probably an operational question, but Tracy had asked, what's the best way to manage a tip pool or a tip share when employees work overlapping shifts? So I'm guessing somebody works lunch, somebody works dinner, and then you've got somebody who does a swing shift. Yeah. So they come in and they work from 12 to 2, and then they work 2 to 4 over happy hour, and then work the first part of dinner to get through the pre-theater push, let's say. What, in your experience?
2 ways I would really approach that. It really depends on how many overlapping shifts you have. If you just have 1 or 2 people who overlap in a given day, you can cash out each shift at the end of the shift. And so the person who's, overlapping them, they would get 2 tips that day, two payouts that day, one at the end of the lunch shift, and then another one at the end of the dinner shift, with 4 hours in the lunch shift pool and 4 hours in the dinner shift pool, for example. Or if you are in a, really high traffic restaurant where you have people starting every hour staggered on the hour, wait until the end of the night, take the collective day, treat the whole day as a single shift, and pay out everybody at the end of the night. Now, for some of the folks who worked earlier in the day, that means they have to come back at a later time to get their tips for the day. Or with a tool like ours, you would be able to distribute those tips at the end of the night directly to their debit card, so they never have to come back in to pick up those tips.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point. We are coming to the end. That was all the questions. I want to remind everybody that Kickfin has these tip pooling templates. You can get them for free by texting the word pool to the number 33777. This is a very complicated area, but again, we just wanted to dust the cobwebs off, sort of kick the fog away, make sure that we just sort of, let you peek behind the curtain here. This is not considered legal advice. This is just guidance from people who get to peek behind a bunch of different curtains. I appreciate Justin and Larisa, all the folks at Kickfin, for making this thing happen. I sit through a ton of webinars, and I try to host a handful of webinars throughout the year. The bottom line is, like, you've got to create a lot of value. And I think you guys have created a ton of value for the people who attended today. So I appreciate you for making the space here. Appreciate you letting me sort of guide this conversation. I learned stuff as I was going through, as I learned more stuff here. So I appreciate it. Justin, Larisa, Beth, thank you very much for your time. To everybody who tuned in, I appreciate it. And again, we will send out the recording of this. By all means, go back and review it as you need. I appreciate all of you guys. Any last words?
No, thanks for
Thank you.
having us.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Take care, everyone. Thank you.